Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the TF Podcast. I'm Jonathan G. Blanco. I'm here with Hsieh, the founder of Concrete. Sean has participated in a couple of our conferences in the past. We've had him on our show before. I'm excited to dive deep with him on what's been happening in the markets, particularly from a real estate point of view. And Sean has like I just said, a startup called Concrete where they're doing fractionalizing the real estate. And Sean, why don't you just take it from there and introduce yourself,
Sure.
please?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for having me on your podcast, Jonathan. So I'm Hsieh, CEO and founder of Concrete. So Concrete is it's a commercial real estate investing platform where we allow people to micro invest. And then for what we're building, we're looking to try to introduce new components around liquidity for commercial real estate. So that's where we feel like we're building something relatively novel in the space. Historically, I'm an entrepreneur. My last company was FlowRoute, and that was, we created that in Irvine and moved it to Seattle in 2012, and that was sold almost about 2 years now, I would say. It's been
What
about
was
2 years since that.
Flow Route? What vertical was that in? Voice,
I was in
right?
telecommunications. We built the first virtual carrier in the United States, and so it was a nationwide carrier, and we serviced a lot of the CPaaS platforms that people are aware of today, and we've helped companies like Airbnb, Etsy, GoGo Air, and a number of other players inside of the tech space with their communication services in the past. But
Nice.
I'm like super fascinated with commercial real estate. It's a passion of mine today. And that's a big reason why we went down, and I'm actually creating this company with my co-founder from FlowRoute as well.
Awesome. It's cool to take that with you, right?
Yeah.
So let's dive right into the commercial real estate then. You said that you are passionate about that. How did that kind of arise in you? Was it Rich Dad Poor Dad?
It was, yeah. Rich Dad Poor Dad, I think, was definitely really pivotal. I think it's hit a lot of people, especially in our generation. I've personally been always just surrounded by real estate in terms of the conversations that my family's had, whether it's, struggling to make mortgage payments or then ultimately like, hey, let's get into this speculative real estate investment over here. That's been something that I've just heard a lot at dining tables while growing up. And then for me, the big thing was once I sold FlowRoute, I was looking for different investment opportunities, and then I ended up investing in a number of commercial real estate syndicated deals. And now I'm actually, owning and operating a motel in Seattle that we acquired about a month and a half ago.
Oh, nice.
And so that's sort of, just Hsieh in his sort of personal realm of real estate. And then we're also, Jordan and I are building a company that's focused on commercial real estate investing. And we have two different focuses around that, which is going to be on the debt side, so private money lending, and then on the equity side, which is, thinking a little bit more like a long-term multifamily sort of focused investment and thinking about cash flows and from that perspective.
Yeah. So to structure the conversation, I'd love to start out with the motel side of it, because I feel like that's something that everybody can relate to, or they understand, real estate from a physical context, and then, hey, you bought a motel. So real quick, why did you buy a motel? Is it to renovate the motel? Is it to keep it as a motel? What's that? And then, just start there, I guess.
So what really started the whole thing was we found a really amazing deal that just from a number standpoint had a lot of meat in the bones in order to turn it into something meaningful for an exit. Quite frankly, it's not like we walked into that deal with a specific goal and like, this is how we're going to execute. So we walked into it with enough room to maneuver around different exit strategies. And once we acquired it, the interesting thing was we acquired it probably 3 or 4 weeks before COVID hit. And then all of a sudden that landed. And then we're like, we got to figure this out. At first, when you acquire a building in this, particularly a commercial real estate building, you're thinking about how do you have your cash flows really support your debt service that's required.
Yeah.
And we thought we were going to be fine. We're like, oh yeah, we're heading into the spring season. There's going to be traveling. I had been thinking a little bit about COVID, but I just didn't think that it would be hitting us that quickly, that hard. And then we got the news and we're like, okay, time to pivot in terms of our strategy. So that kicked off a number of things where we're like, yep, we got to move, we got to change up what we're going to do, and we got to adjust to what we're dealing with right now, which is impacting everybody around the world.
For sure. So I'm just curious, how does one pivot on that? What have you kind of been thinking through on that side?
Yeah, we were originally going to operate a bit more as a motel long term, and I think now what we're deciding is there's still a lot of there's a potential for there to be like short term business, but we're not really expecting that to land anytime soon. And so in the process, we've been figuring out and speaking with the city in terms of how do we ultimately convert this into a more of a multifamily approach. And then if we're doing that, that's sort of the long-term exit. But in the short term, it's like, how do we convert this so it can kind of play as more of an extended stay motel for guests?
Yeah.
So we have what I view as our short-term milestones, and then our long-term milestones for the exit, and everything that we're doing is sort of in line to that long-term investment goal. But in the short term, it's just how do we turn this into extend stay, and then help people that are getting displaced by rent challenges and different life circumstances. Like I think unemployment is a huge topic right now across the globe, and a huge focus in the United States with all these unemployment claims skyrocketing. And what we're seeing here from like a really localized standpoint is we're having people reach out to us when we're putting up these listings, because we're pricing it at this sort of middle ground where it's sort of like a class C motel, right? And so there's a lot of things that you want to upgrade with it, but at the same time you can't really command like certain prices. And then at the same time, like the market itself, the number of renters that can actually pay a very specific price point, they start shifting out of that category pretty soon, especially when they no longer have steady income.
Yeah, no, that's crazy. Yeah, I just thought that was interesting because of the times we're in right now. Like what you're saying. And so, okay, so you've had this interest in commercial real estate, and then you start concrete. Just real quick, give us a quick touch on that, and then we can kind of go right into just what's been happening in the market.
Yeah. So, our original mission was, for concrete itself was commercial real estate for the everyday investor. And what that really meant for us was not only to open up access, but then ultimately build an investment platform that could support investment products that would fit the lifestyle of investors in like 2020 and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up, I'm like a hardcore, millennial, and I grew up in the digital age where I was playing on the internet like pre social networks or anything. So ever since dial-ups, and I even worked at ISPs growing up. And so I think for me, I was just so fascinated by the internet that I'm just like a tech head. I think all my friends would be like, yeah, that's the guy in our group that just plays around with way too many gadgets for no good reason. But I'm fascinated by technology. And so I really wanted to, one trait of mine as an entrepreneur is I love taking technology and applying it towards traditional business models and figuring out how do we actually improve the experience for the users inside of it. And commercial real estate was one that I was just enamored by. As I started investing and started realizing, I was like, whoa, this is a very old school way of doing things. Everything that I'm doing has this like super extensive paper trail. It just felt like it's, there's just so much room for improvement, especially as I've been, heads deep or just knee deep in sort of the telecommunications, like the API world and sort of the tech landscape. Living in Seattle, and similar to being in Silicon Valley, you have these experiences with products where you're like, this is what it should be like. This is really how things should be improving to get to the point where it makes a lot of sense. And I saw commercial real estate in the same way, where as I was investing, I started realizing, wow, these updates are not that frequent. Wow, I'm really out of touch with my property. And I mean, you can be like owner occupant of a commercial real estate investment or even your own investment. And then you're really kind of, physically in touch with it. But I started thinking as an investor, like, I would love to digitize some of this so that I could kind of have my portfolio at my fingertips and really understand and get a better sense of the pulse of what's going on.
Yeah.
And it was just extremely difficult with some of my other investments. And so, I just thought it would be great to be able to redo this, this specific asset class, bring some components that make it fit the lifestyle of individuals today, more specifically retail investors. So, that's what we set out to do. And we've been building Concrete as a platform right now, we're oh, crossing fingers, days away from SEC qualification to open up our first offering, and hopefully bringing out some of the first differentiators that we feel like are going to really help the market mature.
Yeah, it's interesting the way you put it there too, right? By saying, making the asset class available at your fingertips. I think a lot of people don't. When I hear people talk about digitizing real estate, I don't really hear people talk about that particular component. But I don't know if that's the product side of you or what. But I totally see when you said that, it really opened it up for me, right? Because just like you can
Yeah.
go and on the the crypto side, you can go in Coinbase and you can see your crypto that you would have in there, or whatever your exchange was, or if you have like Robinhood, you can kind of see that. But yeah, like if you own property, there's not really this way to understand it. Maybe you like look at the I don't know, the tax records or something, but other than that, I don't know how else you would be
Yeah,
seeing it in
let
this
me take a look at the
digitized way.
checklist of everyone's work.
Right.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head there, which is you get all this news, you get all this connectivity with other sorts of investment products. When it comes to alternative investments and things that are physical, unless you're there and surveying the actual site and taking a look at the building and talking to people, like you're going to be pretty disconnected. It's physically located somewhere. So I think there's a lot of ways that can be improved from a digital standpoint to get you connected to the investment. Concrete, as a platform that we're developing here, there's components around making things a bit more transparent. So just describe like how the investment is working for you, getting you a little bit more in tune, more real time updates on what's happening. So we're hopefully going to be able to bring the user closer to the asset, even if they're remote. And give them a new experience as well. So, like you said, I'm a product guy, so I'm very experience driven in terms of how I think about what a market might want to consume. And I'm still an entrepreneur at heart, so I'm testing things out, right? Like I may think that hey, people want a mobile application to be able to take a look at take a look at their buildings, and then they might want to see like performance data. Like we're going to vet out all these little things as we go along just to see like what level of connectivity do they really want. But I think commercial real estate is fun because it's old school, right? And there's a lot of things that just move slow and they're relatively archaic in many different facets of how that asset class moves today. But we're focusing on looking at the investor side first, and trying to improve the experience there, and then we'll kind of go down the stack and just see how far we can take this thing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, let's go. Let's see how far we can take this thing. So, when you're
Yeah.
thinking about real estate overall, so we're in super crazy times right now, as everybody knows, and we're in a recession, whether people want to admit it or not. Like, perhaps we're in more than a recession. But what's interesting is that for in recent memory, it was about real estate, right? So like real estate drove the last recession, and real estate hasn't seemed to have been affected yet. But I guess it has in a way, in the sense that people are saying, hey, we're not paying mortgages, or we're not paying rents right now, so it's going to start catching up. Kind of, what are
Yeah.
your thoughts about that overall, and how that might compare to what we've seen in the past and what that means?
Yeah, I think so. The last recession that we saw, the Great Recession, was really, the thing that really hit hard was the underwriting. So the looseness of underwriting, like what banks were doing, and then ultimately just how, just the debt, right? The debt sort of like daisy chained on top of each other, and once one thing fell and kind of one domino hit, it created that chain reaction. We're actually seeing some really interesting similarities in different areas of the market today. And so I think from like if you're taking a look at like CMBS, commercial mortgage-backed securities, and you're taking a look at some of the data that's coming in, because that's a lot more transparent than what you would see with like banks or even insurance companies and some of their assets, you're seeing a lot of people right now applying for like rent relief and figuring out how to get government support. So that to me is like an early indicator of stress. And if you're thinking
Yeah.
about it from a macro perspective, like unemployment is a number I'm paying attention to, just because it's a really early indicator of like what's going to happen in our economy. In fact, it's something that I'm quite frankly afraid of, because I think from what I'm staring here, and this is completely an opinion in terms of the data I'm looking up, but I think we're going to be hitting unemployment rates close to the Great Depression.
Hmm.
And when you have that, if you think about how commercial real estate operates and the value, and ultimately like, can you support the whole capital stack in commercial real estate? It's really hinged on like people and movement of people and the economy itself. It's very, very connected. So it'll be a really interesting space where we get into, and I think a lot of people who are a lot of companies and different landlords that are over leveraged are going to find a really challenging time, especially with all these rent and mortgage memorandums that are starting to hit in different states. um, I've spoken to a few friends that are property managers out here, and they're fighting tooth and nail just to get sort of renters to kind of agree to different sort of payment terms. But I think everyone's very open to being creative right now because we understand the circumstances of our economy and what everyone's dealing with right now, the magnitude of the situation, and both from a health standpoint, also an economic standpoint.
Right. Yeah. It's not definitely not a fun situation. And, you've seen people that have done really like gracious and interesting things. Like I read something about some apartment owner I think it was in Brooklyn or somewhere in New York. And he owns like something like 300 apartments. And he said that no one had to pay for the month of April. And then you also see like the opposite where someone's like, hey, you better pay me this. I don't care because you got that. And it's really interesting because, you know, it's, I guess it all comes back to like who is calling the final debt, right? So meaning
Mhm.
like if the rent is being forgiven but the mortgage is not being forgiven, then like so what are you what's your awareness on how that's happening, I guess from like the daisy chain of obligation and how that's going?
Yeah. In full disclosure, like I wish I had all that, like, precisely like research and everything like that. But from what I'm seeing right now, I'm generally concerned about landlords in the position that they're in, because you're getting these memorandums coming out saying people don't have to pay rents. If you drive around Seattle, people are trying to organize rent strikes today. But the funny and the ironic thing is, like, a lot of these landlords also have debt on their properties. And the way that commercial real estate works is it's like a huge mathematical formula. You just have to make sure the numbers pencil out.
Hmm.
But if you start providing rent relief, which allows the tenants to like find some sort of like safe haven, the landlords themselves now are the ones holding the bag because they still own mortgage payments. And so my perspective on this is that you're going to have to work with all the people that are actually that own and hold on to the debt, and hopefully find a way to kind of, I guess, flatten this whole thing out so that you can get creative. And it has to be everyone involved in the daisy chain of finance in terms of debt. Like I don't think you can
Right.
just go, yep, there's one player here where they get to say, they get a hall pass on all this, and then everyone else has to hold the bag.
Well, hey, that's exactly it, right? Like, yeah, because the obligation can't, yeah, exactly, can't just fall on one person. And so there definitely is people that really do need the rent relief, and they should get it 100%, of course. And same with all the way up the chain. But yeah, it has to be like this really interesting coordinated effort, all the way from, yeah, the person that rents to the person that is, or the entity that is, yeah, servicing or maintaining the loan.
Yeah. And the one thing I kind of would hope for, and whether this happens or not, I've just never seen this in history that often outside of like war times, is to approach the situation not with like a who's going to win, but in terms of like how do we get creative as like people to support each other through this time, because
Yeah.
times are tough. And the minute we're not willing to kind of collaborate with each other in terms of how to make this stuff work, it's going to make it really, really tough. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of these like huge disparities in terms of reactions, right? Like you spoke of that one instance where a landlord was like, hey, no rent paid. That's one part of the story, but I think it's deferred, right? I don't think it's just, hey, we're going to forgive your rent completely, right? So it's like, how do you get creative
Yeah.
with the tenant themselves and then figure out a payment plan?
Well, and like
um,
what you said is like in this particular situation, I believe like that landlord probably has less debt on those homes, or sorry, those
mhm,
apartments, right? But
mhm.
like you're saying is like a lot of landlords very likely carry a lot of debt on the mortgage, and then they count on the rent to essentially to pay that down, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, super interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's going to take everyone, I guess, all the different areas of how this works, like including like the Fed, to kind of come in and figure out like what are we going to do, how are the banks going to be involved in this whole process. And it's just going to take a group effort. The tough thing is, I think, from a policy standpoint, you're typically looking at like a layer at a time,
Mm-hmm.
and then whether it's like state or even federal, like they're focused on like one problem and how do you solve this. I think we've seen a whole bunch of things around stimulus where they're trying to package it, but um, you know, everyone's working like as hard as they can right now, and it's just time still ticking and it's impacting so many people. So I think that's where we're getting so much fracturing in terms of how do we solve this problem holistically.
Totally. So with concrete, when you're thinking about the fractionalizing the asset, are you fractionalizing a single property, or is it like are you fractionalizing a REIT, or what is it that you're fractionalizing overall?
So right now, to start, we're fractionalizing a REIT. So we created like a REIT fund, and then so people are fractionally investing into that REIT fund, and that fractional ownership will kind of occur through dividend reinvestments and everything too when you're buying fractions of shares. And then ultimately, I think what we'd like to do, and we haven't done this yet, is fractionalizing the investments that we're making underneath. To then take a look at, are there potentials for different types of like liquidity, like different moves that we can even undergo as fund managers, with a portfolio later on in the future. And then would that even be of interest to like our existing investor base that we're pulling into the platform?
Yeah, no, yeah. So I think it's really interesting, and the reason I was bringing this up is because I was wanting to talk about just liquidity overall, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the assumption is under something like concrete, liquidity is a little bit easier for someone. And I know that REITs themselves can be sometimes difficult from a liquidity standpoint. Is that a fair assumption?
So publicly traded REITs, they're traded on the public markets, and so liquidity is really just based on trade volume. I think publicly traded REITs have probably some of the best liquidity that you could see today, which is, I want to sell something, put an order, more than likely, as long as it's not like insanely off market, you're going to have it fulfilled. Um, but one of the challenges that I see with publicly traded REITs is a lot of the publicly traded REITs are pretty leveraged along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, you're paying a market defined value for the actual stock itself, which may not even represent the underlying asset value, or ultimately like the health of the balance sheet. So what's interesting about that is you may not get what you're really looking for, which is the same economic ride that you'd want out of a real estate asset. Like most people historically like real estate because it provides a little bit less volatility. It's non-correlated with publicly traded markets. So for concrete right now, like one of the investment products we're building is a privately managed real estate fund, and so that won't be listed on the public markets. But we are trying to build mechanisms to help with liquidity. We don't necessarily guarantee liquidity, but we're building out mechanisms that are just different than what you would see in a traditional private investment.
Mm-hmm. And okay, no, that's fair. So how does that? How does the publicly traded REITs, I guess, like? So what you're building doesn't would that apply to someone in a that would be using a publicly traded REIT, or is this more focusing on the private sector then, or I guess individuals, or like kind of like a hedge fund of sorts, or is it whatever the hedge fund equivalent would be to a REIT?
Yeah. It's a private equity real estate fund, and so I think what we've right now in the market, there's for credit investors, it's something that is like pretty easy to get access into.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the private equity real estate funds that exist are for credit investors or qualified purchasers, and so that's where we feel like opening up the access is something that's going to be really interesting for retail investors.
Hmm.
That's why we're really focused on that. And Fundrise is like a phenomenal company. There's a few out there: Fundrise, Diversity Fund. I think Ground Floor is also in the space as well. And there's a few out there that are actually taking advantage of the Regulation A plus offering. And I think from our perspective, what we're building is a combination of like what's in the tech and the platform that we can then use for other sort of real estate offerings in the future, and then our own sort of core offering that we're introducing today too.
Got it. And then are you structured as a Reg A plus, or how are you structured?
Yeah.
Sorry if I missed
So
that.
our offering that we're pursuing right now is a Regulation A plus offering, and I think I mentioned earlier, but we feel like we're close to qualification. We've been working on this for about a year now. It feels like, and it's been a huge learning experience for me and the team. There's just been a lot of work that's kind of gone in. I think particularly around setting up your own, your first set of entities and everything. I think in the future it'll be faster for us, but this first one was a huge learning curve, and it, we're it feels like we're right there at the edge of the finish line here. So we're hoping that we'll be able to have a solid announcement around like, hey, we're officially launched now. We can take in retail investors.
Yeah. And so is the model that you would just do like Reg A plus after Reg A plus for each REIT? Is that kind of how that would work? Or is there just...
Yeah, I think right now that's the goal. And that may change in the future depending on sort of what opportunities present itself for us. I think the framework is pretty mature at this point. Like there's the Reg A plus world has come a long way since it was first introduced. And I think we're now in the midst of proposed changes. They're not going to hit quite yet, but the SEC is kind of going through its stages of the next set of proposed changes, like being able to increase the maximum of a Reg A plus offering from 50 million to 75. And so if you think about it, that's a massive 50% increase in terms of what you're able to raise. And so whether you are doing one or you're doing a series of them, it's just going to really, really help those companies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. No, that's super interesting. It's my background is I thankfully I own my home, but I haven't done commercial real estate. But I think about the Reg A plus from a fundraising mechanism for like startups. That's definitely become, through the Jobs Act became pretty popular. And so it totally makes sense that why not use that for, from a real estate side. I'm curious, were you saying those other companies are doing the Reg A plus as well with their offerings?
Yeah. And in fact, if you take a look at the ratio of who is doing what with Reg A plus, you'll actually find that the majority of the Reg A plus offerings out there are real estate focused today.
Okay.
So Regulation A plus was originally introduced to help companies raise equity from the public, which is kind of like a mini IPO. Going through all the work, I'm like, crap, like that was a lot of work. So it's like, I hope people don't take it that lightly, because there's a pretty significant amount of work to get through all of it. But I can see how this is really beneficial for companies that are looking to just go straight to retail investors and maybe like, open it up for people to access. So, historically, and even today, I would say most startup or early company deals, they're done privately. Like we've seen crowdfunding platforms really pick up, but the amount of funds that you're able to pull in from a crowdfunded deal, just they don't quite match up yet with what we're seeing from like institutional checks. And so I think the interest for startup companies to close the deal quick and not have to deal with crowdfunding has really that appetite for venture capital is still there. But the interesting thing is crowdfunding is becoming more normal too for a lot of consumers. And so I think we're just, we're in the midst of something that's pretty early right now in terms of a larger change in how we think about investing.
Yeah, totally. Well, put on your crystal ball. What do you think we're starting
Crystal
to
ball.
see? Yeah. Or I guess you don't wear a crystal ball. Look at your crystal ball.
I look at my crystal ball every morning when I wake up. Yeah.
So, what's going to happen? What can we expect? So, we were talking about it a second ago, like, hey, we're going to get to close to depression, like numbers, perhaps with unemployment. I think when people talk about unemployment, they're talking about like the new ones that have come up since COVID, which I think is totaling I want to say it's like 26 or maybe 28 million. But I don't know what was in the coffer or what was in the pool before this all started. I don't know how many people were unemployed before, so not sure how those numbers are adding up. But anyways, we know it's definitely over 25 million, probably closer to
Our
30
unemployment
million.
rate was like good.
Was it? Okay.
It was healthy.
Yeah.
It wasn't. I mean, we're dealing with something like completely unprecedented today, right?
Sure.
Like this is truly like a global pandemic, and not only that, but it's an attack on our healthcare system. It's an attack on our economy, and so as much as I think anyone would love to have a crystal ball, I can't say with certainty, right? It's purely an opinion, but from what I'm observing right now and sort of the early indicators, I don't think this is going to stop.
Yeah.
I think it's going to continue to grow. I don't think we're there yet in terms of everything. I mean, if you're taking a look at cases across the United States, things are starting. They're showing early signs of leveling off, but they're not leveled off. Like we don't know yet, right? And so we also don't know like what we're going to expect to see from a potential second wave. And we have all these states that have now opened up a lot of restrictions, and those states may not, first and foremost, may not be ready for the flood of the new infections, of new cases, but they're writing it out, and I don't know what's going to happen. I think I've taken a look into the Spanish influenza and kind of what was happening. Largely focused around Washington and the West Coast, and there was a lot of these things that I feel like they're going to repeat from a historical standpoint. Like they will hold true today, which is we will continue to see after like a brief release, like a skyrocket in known cases. And that's purely an opinion, right? Like I'm not an epidemiologist, so I hope no one is taking this right now and going like, yeah, this is what's going to happen. Because Sean said it here with Jonathan.
For sure.
But it's just, I'm interested. I think the whole roll this thing, in tune with all this data that we're getting right now.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, right? Because all those things have lasting impact. And, when we think about the recession back in 2008, you could still go to the movies, right? Or you could still go to a baseball game, or you could do all these things. And so to have an economy go down or be suffering essentially, and then also have it essentially come to a standstill because there's no, sense of, call it traditional commerce, right? Like there's no more, traditional commerce is not existent. It's all e-commerce,
it's all anything
commerce.
it's essentials, right? Like what are essentials today? And even the essential, like I had to go do a grocery run earlier, and I mean, even Costco at this point has like implemented all these signs and social distancing. And I think what we're used to in terms of the very like, maybe I can use the phrase careless convenience, right? Like we didn't have a care in the world. It's like, if I want to go pick up a stick of gum at 7-Eleven or something like that, I'll go do that. And then I'm gonna go stop, pick up a coffee before I go meet up with Jonathan. And we're going to be doing it in like a super tight knit area, like at a different cafe where there's just like hundreds of people around us.
Yeah.
That is out the window at this point, right? And I think everyone's being very, very thoughtful and intentional around like, okay, like if we have to go run errands, like what's our in and out strategy so that we're just picking up stuff and going, and how do we remain safe? And I think you're absolutely right. I think it's going to change the consciousness of how we consume is going to change dramatically over the next few years. So I've been talking to my family members, and they're like, "Oh, when do you think we're going to go back to normal?" And I'm like, what does that even mean? Like, I don't think that's like a real thing that we should consider, like going back to normal. I think like, what are the changes we need to make right now to curb all this? And then I think we just need to think that, things are just evolving.
Yeah. I have two opinions on that are, kind of weird, but so I totally agree. I don't think we go back to normal.
But what was normal anyways? It was always evolving anyhow, right? Like everything was getting disrupted.
Totally. And so I think that we don't go back to normal, but even if there was the opportunity to go back to normal, it's like, why would you? And what I mean by that is not why would you as a human or as an individual, but why would you, like, as like how social norms happen, right? And I hope this doesn't come across as conspiracy, because it's not. It's what I'm talking about more is it's like my product hat. I literally put my product hat. I've had this conversation, or this type of conversation with people before, when I talk about like the difference between Bitcoin and like a bank having a digital asset, or like having their own digital currencies. It's like, I think banks having digital currencies make a lot of sense for them and their own independent network. I think a digital currency for China makes a lot of sense for China and how it wants to operate, because I'm thinking as China when I say that statement, right? Does it make sense really for the people in controlling it? Probably not, right? And that's why, for instance, I find Bitcoin really interesting. So like, to go back to this topic real quick, is like, okay, wait a second. If we're going to have contact tracing on phones, for these things, and like they're quote unquote necessary now, cool. But like, why would we ever take that off? Right? Again, putting myself in the point of like one of these entities that's kind of, has that benefit, because there's so much data opportunity. So now you start thinking about like all the new data opportunities, or like the new opportunities to, basically segment information that can then make AI decisions on it. And it's like, there's no reason from a technology or from a business standpoint to want to regress those things back. So that's, for me, is always what's really weird about it, is like, even if it probably is fine to go 1000% the way it used to be, it never will be.
Right. Yeah. And I think, we were already seeing huge leaps and bounds through technology. It's sort of application disrupting very specific industries that may be archaic or may have needed a lot of change. And now we're kind of thrown into and cast into this environment where it's like, man, like we have to adopt some of those internet-based technologies, because that's the only way we're getting some of the stuff done today. And I totally hear you in terms of the, like, I was just looking this up, and I think China is going to implement like a completely like blockchain based currency pretty soon. And then they're going to figure out how do they roll it out. I mean, they're pretty much cashless as it is today, but in terms of how cash flows in their whole economy, a lot of it is done through their two sort of private companies. So it'll be interesting to sort of see what happens in that market. And then I think for us too, like, what are those things that we just won't go back to? Like, we're just not going to turn back and be like, yep, that's how we do it today. I'm so curious as to like what's going to happen in movie theaters.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Well, because my whole point always is, you can't control how someone else takes care of themselves, right? And so, like, for me, honestly, that's the whole I would never go. It's going to be pretty unlikely that I want to go, not because of any other reason, that like I'm not convinced that someone else is going to take care of themselves, at least until there's like some level of, what do you call it? Herd immunity, or whatever you want to call.
So now even questioning if we can even get it, even get herd immunity.
Yeah.
And that's a wild thing, right? To consider that might not even be a truth, or like a highly probable thing.
Totally. It's funny because you see, let's talk product for a little bit, and product design.
Yeah.
So, there is this image that I saw of like, hey, this is the new way you're going to travel on an airplane. And I think it's from a product person, it seems really stupid. So basically it was, the bookend seats, so it's like 3 and 3, right? So like let's call it A and seat C face forward, and seat B faces backwards, the middle seat. And then there's like this level of plastic. So like if I'm in the middle seat, there's like this plastic that goes all the way around me, right? And so it's like, hey, this is how we're going to travel now. So like that way, like you don't get in someone's face. What about lining up on the fucking airplane? Like, it's like, I don't understand like how you can separate yourself from getting sick from it. Again, if we're going to, if this is still going to be an issue, changing the way a seat is doesn't matter, because you still have to line up to get on the plane, even if you take 6 steps away because you're going slow. It's just, a lot of that stuff is, to me, is just frankly really silly from, again, just from a design thinking and product perspective. It doesn't make sense why you would do that. I'm curious what your thoughts are. It might feel good that you're like taking some level of action, but you're going to walk by people anyway. So if you are, and again, I'm not saying that I'm concerned about this per se, but if you're putting on the hat of, hey, people need to social distance to then do these things, the second that you get in the same room as someone, if they do have it, there's going to be an issue.
Yeah. I mean, I hear you
from what
completely.
from what we know.
Yeah. So product design, I mean, I almost feel like you're throwing product design out the window because you're prioritizing health and safety first.
Hmm.
And so with health and safety, finding a balance, there's a point in time where it becomes binary, right? Like you can't really fudge it, right? Either someone is really safe or they're not.
Hmm.
You can make it look cool and throw in as much lipstick as you want, or even add some conveniences to help people forget that they're doing something that they may not want to do. But I think that's what we're dealing with right now, with airplane seats to start to develop some sort of consumer confidence that flying is going to be a thing. I think this is just going to be, this might actually, what you're describing might actually be the new normal that we're going to see for like the next few years to come, which is how we used to do stuff is just going to change. Like
Oh, yeah.
it's going to feel weird and discombobulated and not as ideal because we now have to be concerned about this health stuff. And I think there's been a few countries that have been afflicted by it before that are more willing to adjust. But I think it's just going to take more of a herd mentality adjustment from everyone in the economy right now to be like, yeah, this is actually okay. And this is how we're going to do it. Face masks, perfect example. Like in America, that was a really weird thing for people to walk around with face masks. But in Asia, it's very commonplace.
Hmm.
I remember a while back, my friend came back from Asia and he's wearing a mask, and I was just like, "Dude, are you okay?" Like, you look like you should be in the hospital. And I reacted to it, but then he started explaining to me why, and he was just in Asia, and this is actually something that's courteous to you versus I'm super sick, I shouldn't even be around, but I'm hanging out. And so it took a while for me to think about it. I was like, you know what? Yeah, I get it. I get it. Like you're trying to keep all of your fluids inside in case you cough or sneeze or anything like that. And so you're here trying to help prevent the spread of something. Um, but it's going to really require people to shift the way they think about something and to interpret something. And I think what's interesting to me, that what you brought up earlier was like, oh, we're gonna get all this data, like the whole like contact tracking thing and everything. I'm like, well, that's effectively people giving away, converting privacy for
Sense of
being able to,
security, or yeah.
yeah, sense of security, or even be able to know that we have recourse of some sort, right? And this has been a long-term debate in technology for a long time, which is the value of privacy. Obviously, Facebook has gone through a lot of controversy through the situation, and I'm super interested in terms of how this whole thing unfolds over the next 5 years, because one of the big things in web browsers right now is like they're going to possibly even cut out cookie tracking. And then all of a sudden we've had all this ad tech that's been predicated on cookies for like the last 10 years in terms of how do you personalize websites and, retarget and everything. And then all of a sudden that industry might get flipped on its head. Like this is, it's a very
Right.
interesting time that we have. Whereas at the same time, now we're also like tracing.
Well, right. And then so I actually didn't know about that they're thinking about removing cookies altogether, but you can,
Well, it's not the removal of it
or
completely, but it's going to be if you are relying on, and I know you're a marketer, so you're like, we're very used to being able to tap into retargeting or anything like that. Like it's
yeah,
going to change it
totally.
dramatically, and worth looking into.
Sure, sure. And I guess where I was going to go with that is, again, putting like my hat of like, oh, if I'm on the contract tracing or that side, you can say like, oh, well, we actually want to keep all these things because we need to see where someone is visiting. So that way we can have that be part of the contract tracing as well. I know it's really strange when you start thinking about how data can be stitched together.
Yep.
And yeah, it's very interesting. I'm interested for how it's actually one of the reasons I got really interested in cryptocurrency to begin with, and I think really there's only a handful of people that are doing this, I guess, well right now. Is how we start, how the introduction of being rewarded for the monetization of your own data takes into place. So like
Yeah.
there's things like the Brave browser, which does it to like an extent where you can get credits, or I should say their basic tokens for seeing ads or things like that. But yeah, I think that'll be really interesting once we start to see how people are, if and when people get to participate in their information being monetized. And
I feel like that's like right now with our stimulus checks. Like they're getting federal government. Everyone's getting federal government aid, but that's because we've all been taxpayers,
yeah,
right? And it's like as long as you fit within specific criteria, you're getting a stimulus check to like stay afloat. And unemployment is also a system that's really there to help monetize the existence and your participation inside of our society.
yeah.
Um, but I hear you. And from a digital standpoint, it's ultimately like there's all of these private layers, and there's monetization occurring on all those layers. And at the end of the day, like the producer of that data is the consumer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I'm convinced, and people might disagree with me, but when Facebook had a lot of that, sorry, the Cambridge Analytica thing, I don't know why people were surprised about that, right? It's like we all know that data has been sold and then used and monetized, right? Like that's kind of the model is how that works. Um, I don't know. I just have this
Well,
theory.
I feel like maybe we know because we're in tech, right?
Sure.
And we
Yeah, that's fair.
understand that there's probably this whole sort of, underbelly of how, what really happens in the back end in terms of data and how companies are able to make money, right? It's like these services don't come for free.
Right.
Right?
Right.
There's typically some way where they're monetizing. Otherwise, they wouldn't be called a company. They'd be called a nonprofit.
Yeah.
So I think most people have to understand like there is monetization somewhere, and it comes at the cost of something, and someone's paying for it.
Right. Yeah. Because of the data fatigue, or sorry, the privacy fatigue that we all have from data, you know, I just have this hypothesis that if you allowed people to participate in the monetization of their data, they would be more likely they would be less angry, call it, for that happening, right? Because it's already happening anyway. And so it's like, well, okay, because you hear people say these things like, oh, what do I have to hide, or what do I have to whatever, right? And it's like, it's not about hiding. You don't have anything to hide, but like, why don't you get to participate in that? I don't know. That's the way I look at it, at least.
Yeah, I think it's a super fair point. I think giving people choice is probably one of the things that we as a technology industry haven't been doing the best job at. I think a lot of people have I think we've swung so deeply into like convenience over everything, and people will pay for convenience, and that either comes from a bill that they pay or something that they're doing that you're able to monetize off of. And like that's just been the norm that we've been operating under for like the last decade.
I feel like that needs to be a t-shirt, like a satire t-shirt. Convenience over everything. So.
I think that just underpins like our sort of like our like the economy, like our global economy actually, and frankly like how our markets are, like what is interesting to the markets today, and whatever you're in. It's like people are just choosing convenience, right? It's like I'll pay for convenience. Like I think about that all the time. I'm like, could I pay a little bit and then save myself like a whole extra hour today, right? And I was like, is that worth it? I'm like, yeah, for sure. Like I don't have to deal with that. It's less decisions I have to make. And the price tag that I give to convenience sometimes like surprises me, where I'm like, man, if I just would have done like a little bit more work, it would have saved me so much more money, or like I did on my own, right? But I noticed myself getting this pattern of like just going, oh, it's more convenient. Okay, let me just go in that direction and do that. Like I'll choose that option.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. And like you said, it's going to be interesting to see how our behaviors patterns change, and then how social norms, continue to change.
Yeah.
Man. Well, Sean, I'd love to give you the final word. What's something you want to leave our listeners with? Either something you want to say or a question you kind of want to leave them thinking with as they go about their day.
I mean, I'll kind of keep it in line with what we've been talking about. Well, first I'm gonna do a quick shout out. Like Concrete, if you haven't joined the wait list, please join the wait list. We're going to be launching very soon, and would love to have people try it out and like take a look at the platform and consider investing in us. Second of all, to kind of wrap everything up with what you're talking about here, I would love to like leave people with the same question that you asked me. Really, is like, think about how your life is going to change today. Like a parting thought of mine is, I think there's a lot of people that are taking the situation very lightly, and it's challenging because I think there's a lot of people out there that are still thinking about, well, what my problems. But I think a lot of people aren't past that point of thinking about what about our problems, right? We live in a society, we live in a world where it's being shared with everybody. So this is not just about like the me, like everyone has to go through and make personal sacrifices. So I guess the last question or thought that I leave for people is, what are those things that, you know, we're all doing today that we're going to like have to change in the future to then be more considerate about the people around us and the people that are living in the same like cities and their, you know, states as us.
Totally. Yeah, you made me, I know I said you had the last word, but now you just made me think of something that I got to say here so I can remember it is, I'm super crazy fascinated, and to understand how credit markets, make it through all of this, right? And just credit markets and then people's credit levels overall. Like there
Yeah.
needs to be a level of forgiveness, at least from like a credit score standpoint, because if like then you have like this lasting repercussion, that hits people, right? It's like, okay, cool. So I got beat down when this happened financially, and now I got to live through this, you know, my credit score being down for X amount of years. There has to be some change there. But that's for another conversation. But
Oh yeah, totally. And like I said earlier, I think it boils down to collaboration. Like
yeah,
everyone coming at the table, like no matter what role you play, like coming at the table to get creative with like the
totally.
situation. And I think now's the time to be vulnerable with each other, right? Like this is a problem that I have. Cool. We're all in these problems. Let's figure out how to solve these together. Like I think
Yeah.
now is the time where we need to come together to work through this.
Totally agree with you. Awesome. Well, Sean, thank you so much. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
You can reach out to me. My email is sean@concrete.com. Our website is concrete, spelled CONCREIT.com. Feel free to check that out. And then you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, hanging out on your usual social network of choice.
Not TikTok though, right? We talked about that. No TikTok.
Yeah, I think I'm aged out of TikTok. Like I might guest appear in a few videos here and there, but it's because I'm in the background and I'm not really the prime focus. Yeah.
All right. Cool, man. Well, hey, thanks so much for being here. And everybody, thank you for listening and watching another episode of the TF podcast. Please make sure that you are following us on all the social channels, as well as subscribed on wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as YouTube. And you can follow me at JG Product and at TF Blockchain. Thanks so much. We'll have this episode as well as others on all those platforms. And we'll talk to you all soon. Thanks. The views and opinions expressed at TF events and podcasts are solely those of the ones presenting and do not necessarily reflect the positions or opinions of TF Blockchain. TF Blockchain is not responsible for the opinions or content of its guests and does not endorse any particular company or currency. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be used to make investment decisions.